All right, so let's jump in and get started. As I noted last week, Shimon ben Shetach is sort of the more famous of the pair of leaders that are in this couplet, though they're, as we've seen, their comments sort of complement each other. I want to just give you a little bit of background on Shimon ben Shetach, in part because it gives you a little bit of the history of this period, and his experiences very much influenced his teaching. So, Shimon ben Shetach was was a member of the Pharisee community, and for a time served as Nasi, as president of the Sanhedrin, the rabbinic high court. And this was during the reign of Alexander Jannaeus, who rules from 103 to 76, and during the time of Jannaeus's successor, Salome Alexandra, 76 through 67. And Salome Alexander was Shimon ben Shetach's sister. Right? This gives him a certain entree into the court and allows him to enjoy, at least at various times, a certain amount of the king's favor.
I'm sorry, is anyone driving a blue Ford Fusion?
Blue Ford.
It's right there.
Yeah,
They've got
the back door's open. I just wanted to make sure.
Donald,
Oh,
right there, that's
He's learning.
Donald's.
He's
Okay.
learning something.
Okay,
thank you. Sorry,
no problem.
say something.
And during the reign of Alexander Jannaeus, despite the queen's influence, the Sanhedrin was almost exclusively made up of members of the Sadducee community. And over time, Shimon ben Shetach was able to introduce a growing number of Pharisees, many of whom had fled to Alexandria in Egypt because of the disfavor of the king. So it was a long process and a slow process by which they were reintroduced into the rabbinic court. And amongst those who had fled to Egypt was Yoshua ben Prachia, whose name may sound familiar because he was one of the pairs that we had talked about a few classes ago. So if you turn back, you'll find him. But when he returns, Yoshua ben Prachia is elected again to be president of the Sanhedrin, and Shimon ben Shetach steps down to the rank of vice president of the court. And when Yoshua ben Prachia dies, he resumes his role as president, and Yehuda ben Tabai, who is our companion from the previous Mishnah, becomes vice president. The vagaries of the king are such that the pendulum of pro-Pharisee and anti-Pharisee on the part of the king goes back and forth and back and forth, which is why some of the sages say, stay the heck away from the monarchy, because proximity to the monarchy can be extremely volatile and dangerous. And for a period of time, Shimon himself, despite being brother-in-law to the king, or maybe perhaps because he was brother-in-law to the king, has to go into hiding himself. And one of the roots of that may in fact be an enactment that he made regarding Israelite kings, which was that Israelite kings are no longer allowed to judge, neither are men to judge him. And it all goes back to an incident involving one of Alexander Jannaeus' servants who had committed murder. And the Sanhedrin, which was led by Shimon ben Shetach, pushes the king to release the servant to be on trial. And because he is a servant, the king himself is ordered to appear and commit to not exacting any revenge against the witnesses who might testify against his servant. Right? Remember, servants were property, which meant that anybody who testified against the servant wasn't just testifying against someone who was a murderer, but the king himself, in that the servant was the king's property, and therefore the king was harmed by your statements. What emerges during the course of the trial is Shimon discovers that not only can witnesses be intimidated, but other members of the court can in fact be intimidated by the presence of the monarch and the monarch's rather ultimate and arbitrary authority.
Times don't change.
I didn't say that.
He said it for me.
I might have thought it, but I didn't say it.
I have a question.
Yes.
When we started, it was Moses, then Shimon, and there was gaps between them, right? In the periods they were in, and now we've got, at least from 1:6 on down this page, they're all contemporaries.
There's continuity. Essentially, we're introduced to the pairs who are leaders in each generation, and generations overlap. So Yoshua ben Parachia, what's his name? Yehuda ben Tabai, it comes in when Yoshua ben Parachia comes up, but Yoshua ben Parachia was coupled with the person with whom he spent the primary part of his career. Right? And, and essentially, not the closest equivalent that I can think of contemporarily would be the way the Supreme Court can be sometimes seen to work, where we'll talk about the Roberts Court because he's the Chief Justice, but during that period of time, there will be some who will be on the court with Roberts for a short period of time, like, as they're transitioning outward, either by retirement or death, and others who will serve very much and may in fact extend their time on the bench even after Roberts is no longer Chief Justice. But you would talk about the cohort that was sort of together the longest under Roberts, and recognize that some will precede him, some will extend beyond him. And that's kind of what we're seeing here in terms of, for example, Yoshua ben Parachia. But you're right. We had large blocks of time. We had Moses. Moses hands it to Joshua. Joshua hands it to the elders. The elders extend for a period of several centuries. The prophets are multiple centuries of authority, who then pass it to the men of the Great Assembly, which is a very murky group, but it exists for centuries. And then we start to get to the named people who are generation A, B, C, D. So thank you for sort of highlighting that for us. Okay, so when Alexander Jannaeus dies and Queen Alexandra succeeds him to leadership, Shimon and the Pharisees gain great influence. Hey, Bill, are you waiting, or do you have a question?
Yes, I was going to ask Rabbi, did we have written laws at this time, or was all oral interpretations passed down among the judges and the rulers?
By and large, most of this is oral. The Torah at this point is a written document, but all of the rulings and commentaries associated with the Torah remain part of the oral tradition, and as such are very fluid. It'll take about another 100 years or so before the rabbis decide to turn oral Torah into written documents out of a concern and fear that things are going to get lost just because of the growing volume of material and the upheavals that are taking place in the Jewish world during the first century of the Common Era. Okay, so part of the change that's taking place during Queen Alexandra's rule is the reassertion of the influence, or the assertion of influence on the part of the Pharisees, a sort of a erasure of many Sadducean legal precedents, including, for example, a penal code which the Sadducees had introduced as a supplement to the biblical code, which the Pharisees objected to because it was sort of grafted on as opposed to derived through interpretive process. The Sadducees were somewhat more prone to enactments when interpretation sort of was stymied. That said, Shimon himself will engage in a certain number of enactments. So what's bad for the gander might sometimes be good for the goose, to sort of turn a phrase on its head. And he enacts two things to deal with some societal issues that he perceives. One of them was an attempt to restrict divorce, which was relatively rampant in that era. Now, understand and appreciate that a husband could summarily divorce his wife because of the way Jewish law establishes the divorce process, wherein Mr. X goes and has a bill of divorce written and either delivers it or has it delivered to Mrs. X, and that's it. There's not a whole lot of intercession or counseling or anything of the like. And while the husband had to pay the amount set forth in the ketubah to the wife, it was not a substantial enough amount to inhibit summarily divorcing one's spouse or threatening to do so in order to exact whatever one might want to exact. One of the things that we're going to see a little later on is the rabbis increase the amount of financial obligation within the ketubah as a way of balancing the scales a little bit. It's like Shimon ben Shetach has a sort of a first step towards that solution, right? In which he said the monies that were dedicated to the ketubah could in fact be used by the husband in his business, but his entire fortune was then liable to pay the ketubah debt if he divorced his wife. So it turned it from sort of escrow money to usable money. And inasmuch as most business owners were men of limited means, by introducing and using the money in the business, it would be bankrupting for many of them to take the money out of the business, and therefore unlikely for them to do it in order to divorce their wives, or haphazardly. The other thing that he introduces involves Jewish education, which we think of as sort of a normative thing, but up until Shimon ben Shetach's time, there were really no schools in Judea, and instruction was left, as the Torah suggests, to one's father. Right? That's kind of what the Torah says. You got the men of the household have an obligation to educate their children, and that includes both a certain measure of secular knowledge, teaching them a profession, and providing them with Judaic training and knowledge. All right, and Shimon introduces the idea of houses of study being created in larger cities so that the young might receive instruction in Torah and in Jewish law. So Jewish day schools are only about 2,000 years old or so, only. The other salient event in, another salient event in Shimon ben Shetach's life involves a court in which Shimon ben Shetach was the head, which put to death 80 women in the city of Ashkelon who were charged with sorcery. So long before Salem, there were witch hunts. The relatives of many of these women were a little pissed off and were looking for some revenge, and they brought a pair of false witnesses to testify against Shimon's son, accusing them of a crime which involved a capital punishment. The charges were upheld. The son was sentenced to death, and while the court was traveling to the place of execution, the witnesses recount their testimony for reasons that are not clear. Shimon ben Shetach wants to have the case reopened. And his son says, no, you can't do that, Dad. According to the law, we don't believe witnesses when they recant their testimony in this circumstance. If other witnesses come along and say, oh, we know that Shimon's son couldn't have done what they're accusing him of doing because he was with us, or other witnesses come along and say, these guys can't possibly be telling the truth in their testimony because we saw them at a bar that night when supposedly this crime was being committed. Right? So there are reasons why the court can resume hearing a case, but witnesses saying, no, we changed our mind, doesn't qualify because there's this distrust that someone may have tampered with the witnesses after the fact, or that, it just undermines the whole process if witnesses can sort of say, yeah, no, yeah, no. All right. And so Shimon ben Shetach's son is executed, and we'll see now how that experience may be part of what underlies Shimon's teaching here. The last story that I'll share about Shimon is his desire to sometimes go beyond the requirements of the law. And apparently, Shimon was a man of very limited circumstances, and he had a small business in linen goods. Exactly what that means, I'm not entirely sure. Today, we would have said he was in the schmata business. But he apparently sends some of his students to go and purchase a donkey for him so that he can use it to transport the linen goods either to the marketplace or to deliver to customers. When they purchase it, the students, being mindful of the law, say to the seller, when we pay you, this donkey and everything on it becomes our property. So you're selling it with the saddle, with whatever. Right? And the seller agrees, and the students take the donkey and lead him away and bring him to Shimon ben Shetach, who, when he removes the saddle and goes through the saddlebags a little bit, discovers that tucked in there was a very valuable jewel. And his students are going, this is great, this is wonderful, what a blessing for you, because when we bought it, we made sure to give that formula that says, whatever it is, it's ours, or Shimon ben Shetach. Now, think about it, you can finally sort of retire from the business, and you'll have more time for Torah, and more time to teach and study, and this is a real blessing from God. And Shimon ben Shetach says, yes, you are technically correct that by using that formula, everything theoretically transferred to me. But the reality is the seller never had any intention of selling this jewel. And so Shimon ben Shetach goes and finds the seller and gives him the jewel back. And the seller says, praised be the God of Shimon ben Shetach. He is wowed by the fact that Shimon is such an exemplar of ethical and moral conduct. Okay, so that's all I'm going to tell you about Shimon ben Shetach.
Where do you get all those details? That's fascinating stuff, and it's really detailed. I mean, in terms of.
I make it up. No. No, most of it is scattered in the Talmud and other parts of rabbinic literature. Nobody, and most of it, as you can see, is sort of anecdotal. There's not really this, let's tell you the story of fill in the blank, but there's an example of him here and a story of him there, and more recently, there are volumes of encyclopedia of Jewish scholars, of Talmudic scholars, wherein someone has aggregated all of the various stories about Shimon ben Shetach or others, and you can open up the text and you can say, here. And so it's easier. I mean, there's one. I'm trying to see if I'm just looking to see if we have a copy here in the library.
It's the Jewish Encyclopedia.
Well, the Encyclopedia Judaica would have it, but there's another one called the Encyclopedia of of Talmudic Sages, which is a volume about Yefat. But I don't see it on the shelf. It's too bad. Okay.
Thank you.
And for a long time, it was only available in Hebrew. It's now available in English, or has been available in English for a while. But it sort of culls all this together and sort of weaves it into a little bit of a story. Because when you think about it, for as much as I told you about Shimon ben Shetach, you don't know a whole lot about him, right? We know that he lived at the same time as Alexander Jannaeus and Salome Alexandra, so 106 to 67. Whether he's, when he was born a little bit before, dies a little after, so don't have a whole lot of that sort of information. We know that he had a sister who became queen. I don't know how she becomes queen. We don't know anything about that. We don't know anything about his family background. We don't know a whole lot about him. So it sounds like I told you a whole lot about him, but I really only told you 3 or 4 stories out of a lifetime of Shimon ben Shetach. And having said that, we know more about him than we know about a bunch of other sages, of whom we sometimes have only a literal, statement that they made that's captured here in the Mishnah, and it's like, oh, why did he say that? I don't know.
Were Sadducees sort of preempted to go towards the literal writings, the Torah, or?
Well, the Sadducees were sometimes seen as biblical literalists, whereas the Pharisees tended to be a little bit more flexible and creative in how they interpreted text. The Sadducees, or at least a certain generation of the Sadducees, tended to be more, I don't know if fatalistic is the right word, saw everything sort of as preordained.
Okay. Right.
Well, while they would acknowledge the existence of free will, it's like, yes, you may have free will to choose, but God already has sort of set your path, and you just think you have free will because in any given moment you're making a choice, but divine foreknowledge sort of is the guardrails of your pathway.
Thank you.
Also, the Sadducees, whether I'm not completely sure if this is 100% true, but it may very well be mostly true, tended to be inside with the aristocracy and the wealthy. It's part of why the Pharisees have trouble getting onto the court and into positions where they have input and power over the monarchy. Okay, so let's now look at what Shimon ben Shetach had to actually say. Examine the witnesses extensively, but be careful with your words, lest others learn from them how to lie.
It's a big difference.
Yeah.
Yours.
From
Ours said, be careful in your choice of words, lest you say something to lead them to testify falsely. So rather than somebody misinterpret or take it a different way, it's more about the defendant.
Well, yes. I'm not sure that the translators are all that radically different, even though they're using a different language. The concern in many ways is that
How
you word things may prompt someone to answer a question or say something in a direction that you kind of want them to go in, right? It's the distinction I would draw is today in a court, the attorneys are the ones who ask questions of the witnesses. And so if you are the prosecutor, you will frame the question in order to try to direct the witness towards certain answers. If you're the defense attorney, you will frame the question in such a way as to try to guide the witness to give you certain answers. And the opposing attorney during rebuttal will try, or cross-examination will try to redirect the answer to the outcome that they want. Right? In rabbinic courts, there really aren't the attorneys are less relevant, and it falls to the judges who are at least theoretically impartial to really probe and push and examine what the witnesses say and what the witnesses know in order to get at the truth without a concern for either this litigant or that litigant or this defendant. So because how you ask the question can affect the answer, there's a concern that judges be very judicious and circumspect and careful in what they say. And his idea actually evolves in later halakhic literature as sort of guidelines for general rabbinic behavior, in that what I say as a rabbi, if it lacks clarity, can be quoted in a context which may not fit the intent. I'm trying to think of an example. This is a sort of an odd example, but stick with me for a second. Right? Are you able to have benefit from a pig?
Get footballs.
Yes, as a Jew, are you able to benefit from a pig?
I would have to ask you, are you allowed medical procedures using pig parts?
Well, that's a benefit, all right. But generally, are pigs permissible?
No, for food, no.
For food, no, all right. But you can in fact benefit from them, like you can throw around the football, as long as you just don't eat it at the end of the game. All right, you can have gloves or shoes or something else made out of pig. You can even engage in a business involving pigs. In one of my previous congregations, I had a member of the congregation who kept a kosher home, sent all of his children both to Jewish day schools during the school year and Jewish summer camps during the summertime, and who was sat on our federation board, and whose wife was a sisterhood president and then a member of the synagogue board. This is a Jewishy family, right? He also happened to be one of the largest pig and pork product distributors on the East Coast.
Jeff Luckman.
Yes, right? And as he used to joke, don't worry, Rabbi, I never bring my work home with me.
And there's a place called Saul's Barbecue down near the Outer Banks. I mean, people used to see it, and yeah, it's sort of the, people would kid me or something like that. Oh, did you know Saul's Barbecue was down? Okay.
It's so, yeah, can you benefit from it?
Yeah.
Yes, but you can't consume it. Okay? Can you have a pig artery put in as part of a transplant operation? Yes, because you can benefit from it, but no one would suggest that putting it in is a consumable. You're not eating it. More fuzzy an area becomes when a medication which is taken orally has some pork product derivation. There you get, it's just like, how derived is it? How transformed is it in the process of creating the medication? And this is true in all sorts of medications that we don't ever think about, in part because some of the things are used as binders to hold the medication together in a pill form. Right? So there are some authorities who will allow medication X if it's in a caplet form, but not if it's in a pill form. because the caplet, which is a liquid, doesn't contain the binder that turns it into a pill, like a gel cap. Now, imagine if someone asked me a question about pork products, to which I said, yes, you may use them, without some of the context of conversation that we just had. Imagine now someone like, oh, the rabbi said it's okay to eat pig. I didn't, but use pork products. Use is a very, very, so if I was being asked that question in a format where I would have to be particularly careful the way I did in our conversation, in defining a distinction between use and benefit versus consumption.
And then what if you had to look at it as survival? So, for example, straying a little bit, when you fast during Yom Kippur, you're really only supposed to fast if you're medically able to.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm very, very, very strict about people whose doctors tell them not to fast, that they shouldn't fast. I get very, very unhappy when I hear about people who fast when they're told not to.
So if you, by stretching that, it's a choice of starving to death or eating a pig product, are you then?
Yes, you could. Yes, all right. So that's a less frequent occurrence, but let's take it away from, let's say, a pig specific product, but let's say you are stuck somewhere and you can't find any kosher products, right? Obviously, you might give preference to fruits and vegetables and certain other things that are safe. And then you might have to sort of expand into things that are less overtly safe. So for example, yes, I have fruits and vegetables, but I need to have some protein in my diet somewhere because that's an important thing. So I might go with a dairy product as opposed to a meat product. Whether it's a pig or a cow almost doesn't matter because the cow's obviously not been slaughtered and the meat hasn't been soaked and salted. But I'm less worried about what might have been done to the hard cheese that I'm about to have, as opposed to, the meat product. Actually, so if you, I don't know if you've ever been stuck in an airport. I think this happened to pretty much all of us at one point or another. Much easier now than it used to be. But they have these little cheese and nut and fruit little packages. Well, some of them have some sort of meat in them because, again, it's designed to be a protein. So given a druther and I'm stuck in the airport and this is all they have left. I know it's a bit of a stretch, but because they usually have many, many kosher things that just aren't healthy. But I would obviously give priority to the one that has the nuts and the cheese over the one that has the salami or whatever. Because the cheese may not be under supervision, but the likelihood of it containing something unkosher is much smaller than the salami, which is by definition going to be not kosher because the animal wasn't slaughtered properly and the meat wasn't soaked and salted. So therefore, there's no way that it could even be in the realm of, whereas the cheese, depending on how the process was done. Well, rennet is not, first of all, not all cheeses are made with rennet. Second, not all rennet comes from non-kosher sources. A lot of vegetable rennets are used nowadays. So it is much more possible, you know, much more possible. And increasingly, manufacturers are moving away from meat source things because they're not financially um,
Advantageous.
advantageous, thank you, the way they used to be. You know, I remember years and years ago, you used to buy a box of cookies. I wouldn't necessarily buy these cookies, but you would look on the package and it would say, may contain lard and or beef fat and or tallow and or vegetable shortening. Right? Why did it have that string? Because when the purchasing agent was looking for something, he sourced the one that was the cheapest. Straight up, that's how they went about it. And it could be any of these.
Or a combination thereof.
Or a combination
That's
thereof,
why you bought sunshine.
all right? But you don't see that very much anymore. You may have certain manufacturers that still will use lard. This is especially true still in France, where apparently, I have no basis for this, apparently lard makes a really good pie crust.
Yes,
I've heard this,
it does.
all right? All right, so I know bakers who will use lard in their pie crusts regardless of whether it is more or less expensive than a vegetable alternative. Why? Because I want that quality, right? Years ago, I was invited by a local bakery to give them kashrut supervision. And I thought, okay, this could be very, very cool to have a local kosher bakery. And it was a bakery that had a good reputation for producing really good stuff. Okay. But one of the things that I discovered when I was working with the woman who owned the bakery and who was the head baker is she used butter in pretty much everything, which I get. I mean, a dairy cake definitely has a lot more than a parve cake. I mean, the gap is narrowing, but the truth of the matter is, the dairy ones are got a lot more bang for their buck, right? And this included some of the breads that she baked. And I said to her, before we go further in this process, because there was nothing that was not kosher in any of her product stuff. And, she was just as happy to use brand A of butter, which had a hechsher, versus brand B of butter, which did not. Because sometimes she bought A and sometimes she bought B anyway, based on what she sourced. So if I said to her, okay, you have to buy only Land O'Lakes, okay, fine, I'll buy Land O'Lakes. What is it? But I said to her, the challenge you're going to face is, when do many, many Jews buy baked goods? Or for what do many Jews buy? For Shabbat and for festivals, when they serve meat. And therefore, as delicious as your cakes are, they're not going to serve the Jewish community in a way that will be a good return on your investment, because, if Jody and I want a fancy birthday cake that we're going to serve on Shabbat,
Yeah, that parve cake.
we've got to have a parve cake. Well, though, and Jody and I are not even the best example, because we'll serve dairy on Shabbat quite regularly and always have been willing to do it. But many, many, many members of the Jewish community, Friday night dinner is chicken or some other meat or brisket, or Shabbos lunch is meat. And if I'm buying pastries or cakes or whatever, I want to be able to serve it.
Bakery at home did that. Had to go through that. It was, the bakery been there forever, passed down from family. Big bakery, small one in another town. And the community I grew up in is becoming more and more Orthodox. And they had to take all the dairy out. And now they've got kosher, but it doesn't taste as good.
No, I'm sure. Look,
It's, Cool Whip instead of whipped cream on pie.
there are certain things are more replicable, and like the reality is that Paro stuff has gotten a whole lot better over time, but I don't think most people would say it's on a par. It's just gotten better than what it was. I remember when a Parv ice cream first hit the market. It's like, it exists, but who the heck cares, because it's horrible. All right, it's and it's like, yes, you can do a thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you want it. It's like, I love bread and butter, and I inherited that from my grandmother and my mother, both of blessed memory. I can, you give me a good bread with some, I can smear away and polish off half a loaf. I won't put margarine on any piece of bread. It's terrible. And I know that margarine's a whole lot better than it used to be. I'm still not buttering my challah on Friday night with margarine. Oh, if it's a good challah, then I'll eat the challah. I might, use it to sop up something. But margarine does not ever touch my bread, because just no.
I'm surprised at the conversation around meat on holidays and Shabbat. I really thought that we had gotten away from that for a lot of reasons. For many, many more vegetarians, many more people more conscious of not eating red meat, etc. I mean, over the years, going to Passover Seders all over the world, I'm finding more and more they're serving salmon, they're serving other sources and not red meat. So when you just said that, it took me back many years. I didn't realize.
If you go to a Sephardian cookbook, it's going to be more fish and other stuff than red meat. You'll see more lamb, but red meat was more, according to what my grandfather and all those old people told me, is meat was on Shabbos because it was something expensive. It was a treat.
Right, it was special. And there's a whole thing in the Gemara about if there's no meat, there's no joy.
Oh, okay.
All right. So it's sort of ubiquitous, and for many people, while they've cut back on their red meat consumption and their meat consumption in general, it becomes the thing that you dafka or specifically serve on Shabbat. I know that growing up, my grandmother of blessed memory had a routine. Right, you had this is what you ate for dinner on Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, and it was meat. Thursday night was fish and or dairy, so that you had a break before you got to Shabbat, which was always chicken. Right, this was inviolable. To try to convince my grandmother of blessed memory not to make chicken and chicken soup on Shabbos, I might as well have tried to convince her that the sky is green. Right? It's just unthinkable. Toward the end of her life, we were able to convince her that maybe on Shabbat in the middle of July, hot soup was not essential. All right, but that was a very limited concession on her part. The idea that we wouldn't have chicken was like, oh, we are not having that conversation because it would not have gone well, right?
But chicken
but-
was a luxury food.
But yes, and meat was a luxury food, though we had much more of it during the week than she would have ever imagined or envisioned when she was growing up, when chicken and or meat was a Shabbos and festival thing, and it was special as a result. You know, yeah. Yeah, in fact, and there were certain things that my grandmother only made on festivals or on holidays that were meat-based. It's like you could beg for, till the cows came home, and to say that my grandmother indulged me would not be an understatement, but it's like, oh, you want those? Yeah, no. Just no, not happening, kid. That's for Sukkot and that's for Pesach, and it's like, yeah, I know you love them, and I'll make you as many as you want on Sukkot or Pesach, but so, it's, and this story is also, I was in Pennsylvania at the time, so it was like 30 years ago. Okay, so where even the tendency that you're seeing, which is true, was much less true then. So it's just a phenomenology, and eventually she said she decided to try it on an experimental basis, and then realized that she just wasn't getting the traffic from the Jewish community, and she sort of looked at me and said, I guess you were right. And we're like, it's not that I wanted to be right. I mean, the idea of having a kosher bakery, even if it was dairy, was not unappealing, but it was not especially practical. Anyway, so we've sort of gotten far afield. So I just want to sort of bring us back. And Shimon ben Shetach is deeply concerned with the efficacy and the integrity of the judicial process. And he wants to make it somewhat immune to anything that will intrude on that process, even and including the monarch. It's not like he's seeing a point in time when, oh, we'll just get rid of kings. That's an unthinkable idea to him. So how do I even marginalize the influence of the king in the process, recognizing the oversized impact that the king can have? And so for him, the ultimate goal of a judge is to ensure a reverence for truth and proper outcome, to be responsible and careful in what you say so as to not encourage either a mistruth or a false outcome. And I guess he sort of also raises a legitimate and real concern, which is the Torah doesn't exist in this vacuum. It's not an ivory tower set of laws. It's designed for real life situations. And when you're doing that, you're dealing with human beings who have a propensity to make mistakes, who have a tendency to commit sins, who have a proclivity for intentional and unintentional offenses and wrongs, and who will not infrequently succumb to temptation. And the role of the judicial process, and therefore the function of the judge, is to help navigate all of that without distorting truth. That's a really, really high bar to maintain. especially when you factor in that the judges themselves are not immune to all of those human foibles that we sort of set forth. And part of what we're going to see as some of the other instructions to judges manifest themselves in Pirkei Avot, it's about self-awareness. I can't expect you to be completely without bias, but you have to know what your bias is and not let that override your judicial integrity, so that, and, they're very overt. It's like, I'm trying to think of a good, okay, I'm trying to think of a good real life example. In a case in which there's a matter before the court in which you have a person of great affluence and a person of limited means, the concern from the systemic point is, A, I don't want you to favor the affluent person because they are affluent and you think that may be of benefit.
And vice versa.
And nor should you favor the person of limited means because, so I'll fine the rich guy $1,000 and it'll go to the poor guy and he'll never notice. Because while perhaps a true statement, that may be a distortion of justice. If the rules of law are such that I should find with one or the other, I should do so based on the law and not because I have sympathy for X or an affinity for Y. And that problems of society shouldn't be solved in the judicial realm, quote unquote, other than the fact that, the Sanhedrin was also the legislative body of the Jewish people. And the Torah has a lot to say about creating a fair and equitable society. And it falls to the Sanhedrin to sort of say, and this is how we as a society are going to achieve the dicta and the norms and the expectations of our tradition. It's just that the same group are also not just legislative, but judicial functions. That's it. Next week, a whole new pair. And we're getting to some people that are not quite famous. But
Okay.
that was, but Shmai and Avtalyon are not particularly famous, but their students, Hillel and Shammai, are particularly.